The morning arrived slowly in London, bringing with it that orange light that streamed through the tall windows of the mansion's garage. Robert Alden adjusted the rearview mirror of his silver Mercedes and took a deep breath, inhaling the characteristic scent of automotive wax that permeated the immaculate environment. It was 7:30 on a Tuesday morning that promised to be decisive for his business. The meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock would finalize the sale of one of his companies, a business he had been building for over 15 years. He placed his hand on the gear stick, observing for an instant the sun's reflection on the bodywork of the other vehicles parked in the spacious garage. Everything seemed perfect that morning, except for the knot he felt in his stomach whenever he thought of Veronica, his wife. The marriage that had once been promising was now merely a facade maintained for convenience and social appearances. In the last 2 years, their relationship had turned cold and distant, especially after Robert decided to alter his will to include Julia, his daughter from his first marriage. Robert was about to start the engine when he heard shouts coming from the side door of the garage. They were desperate shouts, laden with urgency and fear. He frowned, confused, trying to identify the source of that unexpected commotion. In 15 years of working for the family, Mrs. Clara had never raised her voice like that. The housekeeper had always been a discreet, polite, and respectful woman, always maintaining the composure appropriate to her role. The door burst open, and Mrs. Clara appeared running, her uniform disheveled and her face red from physical exertion. She waved her arms frantically, gesturing for him to stop the car. Robert felt a pang of concern mixed with irritation at the abrupt break in protocol. He turned off the engine and opened the vehicle door, stepping out to understand what was happening. Mrs. Clara reached him, stumbling, leaning on the car's hood as she tried to catch her breath. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, and her hands visibly trembled. Robert had never seen her in such a state. The woman had always been calm and composed, dealing with the most diverse domestic situations with efficiency and serenity. Seeing that transformation in her behavior sent a shiver down the businessman's spine. Mrs. Clara finally managed to speak, her voice coming out in gasps from lack of air. The words she uttered made Robert's world stop for an instant. She said that Mrs. Veronica had tampered with the car the previous night, that she had seen something terrible, and that he absolutely could not drive that vehicle. Robert felt his legs go weak. He looked at the housekeeper, trying to process what he had just heard, searching her eyes for any sign of confusion or deception. The accusation was extremely serious. Robert had known Veronica for 12 years, and they had been married for 10. Despite all the recent problems in their relationship, the idea that his wife could do something to harm him seemed too absurd to be true. He asked Mrs. Clara if she was sure of what she was saying, if there couldn't be some misunderstanding. The housekeeper shook her head negatively, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. With her breathing still uneven, Mrs. Clara began to recount what she had witnessed. She explained that the previous night, around midnight, she realized she had forgotten her purse in the kitchen. Since she needed to catch the bus very early the next morning, and the purse contained her money and documents, she decided to go back for it. Upon entering through the back door, which was always left unlocked for staff, she spotted a faint light coming from the garage. Curious and worried about the possibility of an intruder, Mrs. Clara approached silently. It was then that she recognized Veronica's silhouette, illuminated by the light of a flashlight. Her employer's wife was dressed in dark clothes, completely different from the elegant outfits she usually wore. Beside her, on the floor, was an open toolbox. Mrs. Clara felt a chill in her stomach and hid behind the pantry door, observing the scene unseen. Veronica opened the hood of the silver Mercedes with precise movements, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. For over half an hour, she worked underneath, using tools and tinkering with parts of the engine that Mrs. Clara couldn't identify from her position. The housekeeper said she was paralyzed, not knowing what to do, fearing discovery, and at the same time feeling that she was witnessing something terrible. What most frightened Mrs. Clara was hearing Veronica talking to herself while she worked. The words were low, but clear in the quietness of the night. She cursed Robert, murmured about the dangerous road he would take the next day to reach the neighboring city where the meeting would be held. She said things about finally getting everything she deserved, about not accepting being humiliated by the division of the inheritance. When she finished, Veronica's hands were covered in grease. She carefully closed the hood, put away the tools, and exited the garage through the same door she had entered. Mrs. Clara remained hidden there for a few more minutes, her heart pounding, trying to understand what she had just witnessed. She spent the entire night awake, distressed, torn between the fear of getting into trouble and the realization that she couldn't allow something bad to happen to her employer. Robert had always been fair to her, paid on time, respected her hours, and had never treated her with contempt. He was a good man, and she wouldn't be able to live with the guilt if she stayed silent. Robert listened to all of it, feeling the ground disappear beneath his feet. He looked at the car, at the gleaming hood under the morning light, and then turned his gaze back to Mrs. Clara. The sincerity in her eyes was undeniable. That woman had no reason to invent such a serious story. She had never shown any kind of resentment or interest in causing problems for the family. On the contrary, she had always been loyal and dedicated. With trembling hands, Robert approached the front of the vehicle. He wasn't a mechanic. His knowledge of a car's internal workings was limited, but something in his instinct urged him to check. He opened the hood and began to examine the engine. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but then his eyes caught something strange. There were recent marks on some parts, signs that tools had been used there recently, and then he saw the brake system cables. The cut was too precise to be natural. Robert didn't need to be an expert to realize that this wasn't the result of wear and tear or use. Someone had intentionally cut those cables using pliers or a similar tool. The reality of that discovery fell upon him like an overwhelming weight. He stepped away from the car, feeling nauseous. The woman with whom he shared his bed every night had tried to do something terrible to him. Mrs. Clara approached, placing a hand on his arm in a gesture of silent solidarity. Robert turned to her, and for the first time in many years, he felt tears threaten to spill from his eyes. He thanked her, his voice choked, saying that she had saved his life. The housekeeper merely nodded, saying that she had done what any good person should do. Robert asked Mrs. Clara to go to the staff quarters and not comment to anyone about the situation. He needed to think clearly. He needed to decide how to act in the face of that devastating revelation. The housekeeper agreed and quickly moved away, still visibly shaken. Alone in the garage, Robert leaned against the wall and closed his eyes, trying to organize the whirlwind of thoughts invading his mind. How had he gotten here? How had his marriage deteriorated to the point where Veronica would consider doing something so extreme? He remembered their last arguments, especially the one about the will. Julia, his daughter from his first marriage, was only 22 and just starting her adult life. Robert felt it was fair to include her in the division of assets. After all, she was his firstborn and deserved to be recognized. Veronica had reacted with fury, accusing him of disloyalty and ingratitude. But Robert had never imagined that discussion could lead to something so serious. Veronica had always been ambitious. He knew that from the start. She came from a middle-class family and was captivated by the lifestyle he could provide. In the early years, this didn't seem to be a problem. She was attentive, affectionate, and seemed genuinely interested in him as a person. But over time, Robert began to realize that her interest was more directed towards his wealth than the relationship itself. In the last 2 years, ever since Julia had become an active part of his life again, the tension between Robert and Veronica had become unbearable. His wife made acidic comments about his stepdaughter, insinuated that the girl was only interested in her father's money, and created awkward situations whenever Julia visited the house. Robert had tried to mediate the situation, speaking with Veronica several times about the importance of maintaining family harmony, but she refused to yield. Now, standing in that garage, looking at the sabotaged car, Robert understood that he had completely underestimated the extent of Veronica's greed and resentment. She was not just dissatisfied with the inheritance division, she was willing to do anything to ensure she got everything. The coldness required to plan and execute that sabotage revealed a dark side he had never imagined existed. Robert took a deep breath and tried to calm down. He needed to act intelligently. Confronting Veronica impulsively could be dangerous and counterproductive. He needed concrete proof. He needed to ensure she couldn't escape the consequences of her actions. But at the same time, he couldn't simply ignore what he had discovered and continue living under the same roof as that woman, pretending normalcy. He decided that the first step would be to document everything. He took out his cell phone and began photographing the cut cables from various angles, making sure to capture the details that evidenced the intentional sabotage. Then, he recorded a video explaining what Mrs. Clara had witnessed and what he himself had just discovered. He needed to create a record, something that would serve as evidence if needed later. With his heart still racing, Robert closed the car's hood and walked back into the mansion. The marble stairs leading to the second floor had never seemed so long. Each step seemed to weigh more than the last. He knew Veronica was still home, probably getting ready in her room. They had been sleeping in separate rooms for over a year, another symptom of their failed relationship. Reaching the top of the stairs, Robert paused for a moment before Veronica's bedroom door. He could hear the muffled sound of music coming from inside. He took another deep breath, mentally preparing himself for the confrontation he was about to have. He didn't know exactly what he would say or how she would react, but he knew he needed to look into that woman's eyes and understand the extent of her coldness. He knocked on the door 3 times, firmly. Veronica's voice came from the other side of the door, calm and melodious as always. She told him to come in, that the door was open. Robert turned the doorknob and pushed the door open, revealing the luxurious bedroom that Veronica had decorated with refined and expensive taste. French silk curtains adorned the windows. An antique French dressing table occupied a privileged corner, and the aroma of an imported perfume hung in the air. Veronica was sitting at the dressing table, applying red lipstick to her lips with precise and delicate movements. She wore an elegant navy blue dress. Her dark brown hair was impeccably styled, and her jewels sparkled under the soft bedroom light. At 42, she maintained a striking beauty, the result of constant care at aesthetic clinics and exclusive gyms. Through the mirror, she caught Robert's reflection standing at the door and smiled. Her smile was what disturbed Robert the most at that moment. It was natural, carefree, almost warm. How could someone smile like that after having spent the previous night sabotaging her own husband's car? The dissonance between what he knew she had done and the tranquility she displayed was frightening. Veronica turned in her chair to face him directly, crossing her legs elegantly. She asked if he was well, commenting that he looked pale. She said she hoped he wasn't falling ill precisely on the day of such an important meeting. Her words carried apparent concern, but Robert could now perceive something different in her tone, a subtle falsity that had always been there, but which he had chosen to ignore. She asked if he was leaving soon to avoid traffic, mentioning that the road to Brighton usually got congested after 8 o'clock. Robert entered the room and closed the door behind him. He needed to maintain his composure. He couldn't let her realize he knew everything, not yet at least. He replied that he was fine, that he had merely had a restless night thinking about the business details. Veronica nodded understandingly, rising from the dressing table and walking to the closet to retrieve a handbag. As she rummaged through her things, Robert observed every movement. He tried to find some sign of nervousness, some crack in the mask of normalcy she wore. But Veronica seemed completely at ease, organizing items in her bag and commenting on her own plans for the day. She mentioned that she had an appointment at the beauty salon and would then meet some friends for lunch at the club. Robert decided to test the waters. He casually commented on the car, saying he was thinking of taking it for a service as he had noticed some strange noises in recent days. He carefully observed her reaction. Veronica barely looked up, replying indifferently that he should indeed do that he couldn't risk having mechanical problems precisely now that he had so many important engagements. The coldness of that response confirmed everything Robert needed to know. She was expecting him to use that car. She was counting on it. He felt a tightness in his chest, a mixture of anger and sadness so intense that he had to control the impulse to confront her right then and there. But he remembered what Mrs. Clara had told him, the words Veronica had murmured alone in the garage. She had planned it meticulously, and if he wasn't careful, he might not be able to prove anything. He decided to change strategy. He sat in the armchair near the window and began to talk about their marriage. He mentioned that he felt they were growing increasingly distant. that perhaps they needed to have a serious conversation about the future of their relationship. Veronica stopped what she was doing and stared at him with an expression Robert couldn't quite decipher. There was surprise there, but also something that seemed like calculation. She asked why he was bringing that up precisely that morning, if it wouldn't be better to have this conversation at another time. Robert insisted, saying they couldn't keep postponing it indefinitely. Veronica sighed and sat on the edge of the bed, crossing her arms over her lap. The defensive posture was evident now, and Robert realized he had touched a sensitive point. Veronica began to speak, and her voice lost its earlier melodious tone. She said she was tired of being treated as secondary, that she had dedicated 10 years of her life to him and their marriage, and that it wasn't fair to be placed on the same level as Julia in the division of assets. She argued that Julia had spent most of her life distant, living with her mother, and had suddenly appeared wanting to claim rights she hadn't earned. Robert tried to explain that Julia was his daughter and that he had responsibilities towards her regardless of past circumstances. Veronica laughed, but it was a bitter, humorless laugh. She said he had always been naive, that he didn't see that Julia was only interested in his money. Robert retorted that it wasn't true, that his daughter genuinely wanted to rebuild their relationship. The discussion began to escalate. Veronica abruptly rose from the bed and walked to the window, turning her back to Robert. She said she felt humiliated by the way he had altered the will without even consulting her. She argued that as his wife she should have priority over everything and everyone. Robert tried to remain calm, explaining that he had made that decision precisely to be fair to both of them, that he wasn't taking anything away from Veronica. But Veronica was not interested in rational arguments. She turned back to him, and this time her expression was different. There was hardness there, a determination Robert recognized from previous situations when she wanted something and wouldn't take no for an answer. She said she wouldn't accept a divorce that left her with less than she deserved, that the prenuptial agreement they had signed was unfair, and that she would fight for her rights. Robert suggested that perhaps they could renegotiate the terms, find a solution that satisfied both of them. Veronica shook her head, saying she didn't want crumbs. She wanted everything. She enumerated the assets she considered hers by right: the mansion, the companies, the bank accounts, the investments. Robert felt a chill run down his spine upon hearing that list. It was as if she was already planning a future without him. Then Veronica said something that made Robert's blood run cold. Looking directly into his eyes, with an expression that mixed defiance and veiled threat, she commented that life was fragile and unpredictable. She said that accidents happened every day, especially on dangerous roads like the one he would take to Brighton. She mentioned that it would be terrible if something happened to him precisely now, when he had so many pending business matters. The words were carefully chosen so as not to constitute a direct confession, but the intent behind them was crystal clear. Robert felt nauseous. There was the confirmation of everything Mrs. Clara had reported. Veronica had not only sabotaged the car, she was confident enough to insinuate her intentions. Believing he had no way to prove anything, Robert rose from the armchair, struggling to maintain his composure. He said he needed to go, that he couldn't be late for the meeting. Veronica smiled again, in that way that now seemed utterly sinister. She approached him and smoothed the lapel of his suit, a gesture that in other times might have seemed affectionate, but now sounded like mockery. She wished him to drive carefully and to return safe and sound. Robert left the room feeling his legs wobbly. He descended the stairs, holding onto the banister, needing the physical support to keep from stumbling. He reached the ground floor and went straight to his study, closing and locking the door. He sat behind his desk and buried his face in his hands, trying to process everything that had just happened. The confirmation that Veronica had indeed attempted something against him was devastating. Robert thought of all the years they had spent together, the trips they had taken, the moments they had shared. Had she always been like this, calculating and capable of such coldness? Or had she gradually transformed, corroded by greed and resentment? He had no answers, only the certainty that he could not continue pretending that everything was normal. He picked up his cell phone and dialed Maurice Fletcher, his trusted lawyer for over 20 years. Maurice answered on the first ring, greeting him cheerfully and asking if everything was set for the morning meeting. Robert interrupted, saying he needed him to come to the mansion immediately. Something serious had happened, something that couldn't be discussed over the phone. The urgent tone in Robert's voice made Maurice understand that it was serious. The lawyer said he would cancel his morning appointments and be there in 40 minutes. Robert thanked him and hung up. Then he made another call, this time to the executive taxi company he usually used, cancelling the car he had requested to take him to Brighton. He explained that he had an unforeseen issue and would reschedule the meeting. While waiting for Maurice's arrival, Robert thought of Mrs. Clara, that simple woman who earned a modest salary and lived in a rented house in a nearby working-class neighborhood, had risked her position and safety to save him. She had no obligation to get involved. She could have simply ignored what she saw and gone about her life. But she chose to do what was right, guided by principles that many people with far more resources and education did not possess. Robert decided at that moment that, regardless of what happened from then on, he would ensure Mrs. Clara was rewarded for her courage and integrity. She deserved much more than a simple thank you. She deserved security, comfort, and the peace of mind of knowing she had made a difference in someone's life. The minutes dragged on as Robert waited. He got up and went to the study window, observing the impeccably maintained garden. Gardeners worked on the plants, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside the house. Life continued its normal course outside, while within those walls everything was crumbling. Maurice Fletcher arrived at the mansion exactly 43 minutes after the call. Robert received him personally at the door, dismissing the butler who normally performed that function. The lawyer was a 58-year-old man, with neatly trimmed grey hair, discreet framed glasses, and an immaculate grey suit. His usually calm expression now showed signs of concern as he noticed Robert's visibly shaken state. They went to the study, and Robert locked the door again. Maurice sat in one of the leather armchairs, while Robert remained standing, pacing back and forth. The lawyer waited patiently, knowing his client well enough to know he would speak when he was ready. Robert finally stopped before the window, his back to Maurice, and began to tell everything. He recounted Mrs. Clara's desperate warning, her testimony about what she had witnessed in the garage during the early hours, his own inspection of the car, and the severed cables he had found. Maurice listened in silence, his face growing progressively more serious with each detail revealed. When Robert mentioned the conversation he had had with Veronica moments earlier, especially the veiled insinuations about accidents and the fragility of life, the lawyer leaned forward in his armchair. Robert finally turned to face him. He showed the photos and videos he had recorded in the garage, enlarging the images on the computer so Maurice could clearly see the cuts in the cables. The lawyer examined everything with professional attention, asking specific questions about timings, details of Mrs. Clara's testimony, and the exact sequence of events. His legal mind was already at work, analyzing angles and possibilities. Maurice leaned back in the armchair and removed his glasses, cleaning the lenses as he thought. He told Robert that the situation was extremely serious, that what Veronica had attempted to do had no other definition than a deliberate attempt to seriously harm him. However, he warned that proving this legally would be challenging. A good defense lawyer could argue that Mrs. Clara had fabricated the story for some personal motivation, or that someone else had access to the garage. Robert felt frustration grow within him. He asked if the photos of the cut cables weren't sufficient proof. Maurice patiently explained that the photos proved sabotage had occurred, but didn't necessarily identify the perpetrator. Without additional witnesses or physical evidence directly linking Veronica to the act, it would be a complicated legal battle. He suggested they needed to involve the authorities, but strategically. The lawyer knew a trusted detective, someone experienced and discreet who could conduct an appropriate investigation. Maurice took out his cell phone and made a call, briefly explaining that he had a delicate situation that required immediate attention from someone he trusted. So after a brief conversation, he hung up and informed Robert that Detective Henry Campbell would be there in less than an hour. While they waited, Maurice instructed Robert on how to proceed. It was crucial that he did not confront Veronica directly about his suspicions or let on that he knew about the sabotage. They needed time to gather more solid evidence. Robert agreed, although the idea of having to feign normalcy in front of that woman deeply disgusted him. Maurice also suggested that they speak with Mrs. Clara before the detective arrived, so she could recount everything again in detail. Robert agreed and sent a message to the housekeeper, asking her to come to the main house discreetly. She arrived a few minutes later, visibly nervous about being called to the study, where normally only important matters were discussed. Robert immediately reassured her, introducing Maurice and explaining that she wasn't in trouble, quite the opposite. They needed her to repeat exactly what she had seen the previous night, with all the details she could remember. Mrs. Clara sat on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped in her lap, and began her account again. This time Maurice asked specific questions, establishing a precise chronology of events. What time exactly had she left home? What time did she return? Through which entrance? Where was the moon that night? Was there enough light to see clearly? Mrs. Clara answered everything with the calm of someone telling the truth, without contradictions or hesitations that could indicate fabrication. She described Veronica's exact position in the garage, the tools she saw in the box, the movements her employer's wife made while working under the car's hood. She repeated the words she had heard Veronica murmur, about deserving to keep everything, about the dangerous road, about finally getting what she wanted. The testimony was consistent and detailed, imbued with an authenticity that could not be faked. Maurice thanked Mrs. Clara for her courage and integrity. He explained that a detective would be coming to speak with her shortly, and that she should tell exactly the same story, without omitting or adding anything. The housekeeper nodded, saying she was willing to do whatever was necessary. Robert held her hand for a moment, his eyes conveying a gratitude that words could not adequately express. Detective Henry Campbell arrived punctually. He was a serious-looking man, his early 50s evident in the expression lines and the white strands beginning to dominate his hair. He wore discreet civilian clothes and carried a leather briefcase worn from use. Maurice greeted him with familiarity, and it was clear that the two had worked together on other cases over the years. Robert repeated the entire account a third time, now for the detective. Henry listened with professional attention, making occasional notes in a small notebook. When Robert finished, the detective asked to see the photographic evidence and speak with Mrs. Clara personally. She was called again and recounted everything once more, maintaining the same impressive consistency in every detail. Henry listened to her without interruption, then asked a few additional questions to clarify specific points. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. He said the situation was serious and that there were enough elements to justify a formal investigation. However, he warned that they needed to proceed with extreme caution. The detective explained that cases involving people with significant financial resources tended to complicate rapidly. Expensive lawyers could create alternative narratives, question the credibility of witnesses, and turn the process into a prolonged and draining battle. They needed irrefutable evidence that left no room for alternative interpretations. Henry suggested they conduct a search of the house, specifically Veronica's bedroom and belongings, looking for the tools she had used or any other physical evidence linking her to the sabotage. He could obtain a warrant based on Mrs. Clara's testimony and the photos of the cut cables, but this would take a few hours and alert Veronica that she was under investigation. Robert had an idea. Veronica had mentioned she would be out all day, first at the salon and then at the club with friends. This would give them a few hours to conduct a discreet search without alerting her. Henry considered the suggestion, but hesitated, explaining that a search without a warrant could legally compromise any evidence found. Maurice intervened, suggesting that Robert, as the homeowner, could technically authorize access to any room. It was a legal gray area, but Henry agreed it was worth a try, especially if they found something they could use to obtain a formal warrant later. They decided to wait until Veronica left the house. Robert sent a message to the private driver she usually used, asking him to inform him when he took her away. The reply arrived 15 minutes later. Veronica had just gotten into the car and given instructions to go to the beauty salon in Mayfair. She had mentioned she would be out all day. It was the moment they had been waiting for. Henry, Maurice, and Robert went up to Veronica's bedroom, taking Mrs. Clara with them, so she could identify any item she recognized from the previous night. The bedroom was immaculate, as always. The bed was made with military precision. There were no clothes thrown about, no signs of disorder. Veronica was meticulous with her personal organization, a personality trait Robert had always admired, but now realized could work against her. Organized people tend to store things systematically, and this would facilitate the search. It was Robert who noticed a subtle inconsistency. At the back of the closet, there was a row of stacked shoeboxes. Most were perfectly aligned, but one of them, on the second shelf from the bottom, was slightly displaced. It was such a small detail that anyone could ignore it, but Robert knew Veronica's obsessive perfectionism well. She would never leave something out of alignment due to carelessness. Henry carefully picked up the box, using a handkerchief to avoid leaving additional fingerprints. He opened it and found, instead of shoes, a pair of industrial rubber gloves. Even from a distance, the dark stains covering them were visible. Mrs. Clara approached and immediately confirmed that those were the gloves she had seen Veronica wearing the previous night. The stains were automotive grease, still fresh enough to smudge fingers to the touch. Maurice and Robert exchanged significant glances. There was concrete physical evidence directly linking Veronica to the sabotage. Henry photographed the gloves in situ before removing them from the box, carefully placing them in a transparent plastic bag he had brought with him. He commented that this, combined with Mrs. Clara's testimony and the photos of the cut cables, was starting to form a solid case. But they didn't stop there. Henry suggested they check Veronica's digital history, especially her personal computer and phone. Robert knew she kept a laptop in the bedroom, which she primarily used for online shopping and keeping in touch with friends through social media. The computer was on a delicate writing desk near the window, closed but unlocked. Robert hesitated for a moment. Invading Veronica's computer seemed like a significant violation of privacy, even considering everything she had done. But Maurice reminded him that they were trying to prevent her from escaping something very serious she had attempted to do. Sometimes, uncomfortable measures were necessary to ensure the truth came to light. The laptop was not password protected, another demonstration of Veronica's overconfidence that she would never be discovered. Henry opened the browsing history, again using a handkerchief to avoid leaving fingerprints. What they found there was even more incriminating than the gloves. Over the past 3 months, there were dozens of searches related to automotive mechanics. Veronica had specifically researched brake systems, how they worked, what the critical components were. She had visited forums where people discussed mechanical problems and their causes. Even more disturbingly, there were searches about accidents on winding roads, statistics on brake failures, and even a video tutorial on how to identify vulnerable points in automotive systems. Henry noted down each relevant URL, taking screenshots as evidence. Maurice watched over his shoulder, shaking his head in disbelief. It was as if Veronica had left a digital diary of her intentions, a complete trail of premeditation. Robert felt a contradictory mix of relief at having such clear evidence and horror at realizing how calculated his wife's attempt against him had been. There were also searches about inheritances and wills, about spousal rights in cases of unexpected events, about life insurance and legal procedures following tragic occurrences. It was a macabre collection of information that painted an unequivocal picture of what Veronica had planned. She not only wanted to harm Robert, she had meticulously studied the consequences and benefits she would obtain. Detective Henry closed the laptop and turned to Robert and Maurice. He said they had more than enough material to proceed. The greasy gloves, Mrs. Clara's eyewitness testimony, the photos of the cut cables, and now the internet history formed a robust case. He would immediately request a formal search and seizure warrant and an order for interrogation. Maurice agreed, but suggested they be even more strategic. Veronica would likely return home in the late afternoon, expecting to hear news of a road accident. Her reaction upon discovering that Robert was well and at home could be revealing. Henry considered the idea and proposed setting up a discreet surveillance operation with plainclothes officers already positioned when she arrived. Robert agreed to the plan, although the idea of spending a few more hours feigning normalcy nauseated him. They went back down to the study, where Henry made several calls organizing the operation. Maurice used the time to draft a formal statement from Robert about the events, which would be used in the legal process that would inevitably follow. Mrs. Clara was released to return to the staff quarters, with instructions to remain available for when the police needed her formal testimony. Robert escorted her to the door, thanking her again. The housekeeper simply squeezed his hand and said she hoped everything would resolve in the best possible way. There were tears in her eyes, not of fear but of relief for having done the right thing. The following hours dragged on with agonizing slowness. Robert tried to work, answer emails, make calls about the meeting he had rescheduled, but his mind constantly returned to what was to come. Morris remained with him, offering moral and legal support as needed. Henry left to organize his team, but maintained constant contact via phone. Around 4 in the afternoon, Veronica's driver sent a message informing him that he was bringing her back. She had spent the day as planned, first at the salon and then lunching at the club. She was apparently in good spirits, chatting animatedly about a trip she intended to take. The driver estimated arrival in approximately 25 minutes, depending on traffic. Henry returned to the mansion with 3 plainclothes officers. They positioned themselves discreetly in the living room, where they would not be immediately visible from the main entrance. Robert was instructed to receive Veronica normally, as if he were simply home earlier than expected. Maurice would remain in the study, out of sight, ready to intervene if necessary. Robert sat in the living room, trying to appear relaxed while his heart pounded. He listened to every sound coming from the street, anticipating the car's arrival. Henry was seated in a side armchair, casually flipping through a magazine, but his alert eyes missed no detail. The other officers remained in positions that allowed them to view the main entrance. The sound of an arriving car's engine filtered through the windows. Robert felt his breath quicken. Footsteps approached the door, followed by the sound of a key turning in the lock. The door opened and Veronica entered, carrying several shopping bags from expensive mall stores. She was radiant, her freshly styled hair gleaming under the light of the entrance chandelier. Her smile vanished the instant she saw Robert sitting in the living room. For a fraction of a second, her expression revealed pure shock and disbelief. She clearly hadn't expected to see him there, much less safe and sound. The mask of tranquility she had maintained all day visibly cracked. She let the shopping bags fall to the floor, the sound echoing in the tense silence that had settled. Robert observed every micro-expression cross Veronica's face: shock, confusion, fear, and then, as she tried to regain her composure, to her desperate attempt at normalcy. She asked what he was doing home so early, why he hadn't gone to the meeting in Brighton. Her voice tried to sound casual, but it came out slightly high-pitched, betraying her nervousness. It was at that moment that Henry rose from the armchair, showing his identification. The other officers also revealed themselves, positioning themselves strategically around the room. Veronica instantly paled, her eyes wide as they darted from one officer to another, trying to understand what was happening. She looked at Robert with an expression that mixed accusation and growing panic. Detective Henry formally introduced himself and explained that they were there to interrogate her about a serious incident involving vehicle sabotage. Veronica tried to laugh, a forced and artificial sound, saying there must be some mistake. She looked at Robert seeking support, but he merely stared back with a hard expression she had never seen before. Henry asked her to sit down. Veronica obeyed mechanically, sinking onto the sofa, her legs apparently too weak to support her. The detective then began to enumerate the evidence. Mrs. Clara's testimony about what she had witnessed in the early hours, the greasy gloves found hidden in her closet, her computer's search history regarding brake systems and automotive sabotage. With each item mentioned, Veronica grew paler. She tried to interrupt several times, but Henry continued relentlessly. When he showed the photos of the cut cables in Robert's car, enlarged on his tablet so that the precise cuts were clearly visible, Veronica began to tremble. Her hands clutched the sofa fabric, her knuckles white from the pressure. She tried to deny it, saying that it was all an absurd misunderstanding. The gloves weren't hers, someone must have put them there to frame her. The computer's history could have been accessed by anyone. The house had several staff members. Her voice became progressively more desperate, her denials sounding less and less convincing. Henry let Veronica speak, observing her with the experience of someone who had interrogated hundreds of people. When she finally paused to breathe, He calmly pointed out the inconsistencies in her claims. He asked why someone would want to frame her specifically, which staff member would have access to her private bedroom and personal computer. Veronica had no satisfactory answers, merely looking around the room like a cornered animal. It was then that Robert finally spoke. His voice was low but firm, laden with deep sadness, mixed with contained anger. He asked Veronica how she had managed to sleep the previous night, knowing what she had done. He asked how she had managed to wake up that morning, get ready so calmly, and wish him to drive carefully, knowing she was sending him to a possible fatal accident. Veronica tried to respond, but no words came out. Tears began to stream down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She opened her mouth several times, but each attempt to form a sentence died before it began. The weight of the situation finally seemed to be breaking her defenses. Henry seized the moment of vulnerability. He explained to Veronica that the evidence against her was overwhelming, that she would be formally accused of premeditated attempted grievous bodily harm. He said it would be better for her to cooperate now, that any chance of leniency depended on honesty. Veronica looked at him with desperate eyes, then turned her gaze back to Robert. For a moment it seemed she would confess. Her mouth opened, words began to form. But then something changed in her expression. A hardness returned to her eyes, a determination born of desperation. She wiped away her tears abruptly and declared that she would say nothing further without the presence of a lawyer. Henry nodded, expecting precisely that response. He signaled to one of the officers, who approached with handcuffs. Veronica looked at the handcuffs in horror, the reality of what was happening finally sinking in completely. She would be taken for formal interrogation, where she would have the right to legal representation, but the evidence was already consolidated. When the handcuffs clicked on her wrists, Veronica let out a sob. She looked at Robert one last time, and for an instant he saw not the calculating woman who had tried to harm him, but the person he had known years ago, vulnerable and frightened. But the moment quickly passed. The officers escorted her towards the door, reading her rights as they walked. Robert remained seated as he heard the front door close. The sound echoed through the empty house, seeming definitive and irreversible. Maurice came out of the study where he had remained throughout the scene and sat beside Robert. Neither of them said anything for several minutes, just absorbing what had just happened. Finally, Maurice broke the silence. He said that the legal process would be long and probably complicated, but that with the evidence they had, a conviction was practically certain. Veronica would face serious consequences for her actions. Robert merely nodded, feeling strangely empty. He had imagined he would feel satisfaction or relief at this moment, but all he felt was a profound sadness. Maurice remained at the mansion for a few more hours, helping Robert process the next practical steps. There would be depositions to give, paperwork to sign, legal procedures to follow. He promised to take care of everything, ensuring Robert wouldn't have to deal with more stress than necessary. When he finally left, it was already getting dark outside. Robert was left alone in the large mansion. He walked through the rooms, observing everything with new eyes. That house he had built with such pride, which should have been a home full of love and happiness, had become the stage for something dark and destructive. Every object seemed laden with memories that were now tainted by the discovery of what Veronica had tried to do. He went up to her bedroom, standing still on the threshold. The room still smelled of her perfume. Things were still organized exactly as she had left them that morning. It was surreal to think that just hours before, she had been there getting ready, hoping her plan would succeed. Robert closed the door and decided he would have all her belongings removed the next day. He went down again and went to the staff quarters where Mrs. Clara lived. He knocked on the door, and she answered quickly, her eyes still red from crying. She had watched from the window as the police took Veronica away, and the reality of the situation had deeply shaken her. Even knowing she had done the right thing, it was hard not to feel responsible for another person's fate. Robert entered and sat at her simple kitchen table. Mrs. Clara served coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she held the cup. They sat in silence for a moment, each dealing with their own thoughts and emotions. Finally, Robert held her hand across the table and said that she had saved his life, literally. Mrs. Clara began to cry again, saying she couldn't believe Mrs. Veronica was capable of something like that. She had worked for the family for so long, had seen the marriage in its better days, and it was painful to witness how everything had deteriorated. Robert agreed, sharing his own difficulty in processing how things had reached that point. He told Mrs. Clara that he wanted to reward her adequately for her courage. She tried to refuse, saying she had only done what her conscience dictated, but Robert insisted. He explained that he would arrange a significant sum that would allow her to buy her own house and live with more comfort and security. She deserved that and much more. Mrs. Clara protested that it was too much, that she expected no reward, but Robert was firm, saying it was non-negotiable. She had demonstrated a character and integrity that were rare in the world, especially considering she had no obligation whatsoever to get involved. Many people in her position would have simply looked the other way, out of fear of the consequences or simple indifference. The housekeeper finally accepted, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. She said she would use the money wisely, that she could finally provide a better life for her grandchildren who visited occasionally. Robert felt a warmth in his chest, the first truly positive emotion he had experienced since that morning. At least something good would come out of that terrible situation. They talked for some more time, sharing memories of the years Mrs. Clara worked for the family. She told funny stories from when Robert and Veronica still seemed happy, of parties they organized, of moments that seemed genuine. It was strange and melancholic to revisit those times now, knowing how everything had ended. When Robert finally returned to the mansion, it was late at night. He went up to his bedroom, but knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. He sat in the armchair near the window, looking at the garden illuminated by the moon. He thought of Julia, his daughter, and decided he would call her in the morning. She deserved to know what had happened, though he still didn't know how to explain everything. He also thought about his marriage to Veronica, trying to pinpoint the exact moment everything began to unravel. Was it when he first mentioned wanting to include Julia in the will? Or were the problems older, merely hidden beneath a layer of social courtesy and marital routine? Robert wasn't sure, and perhaps never would be. What he knew for sure was that he had completely underestimated the power of greed and resentment. He had believed that, despite all the problems, there was still respect and some residual affection between him and Veronica. The discovery that she was willing to go so far to get what she wanted was a devastating revelation about human character and his own judgment. The following days were a blur of legal activities. Robert gave his formal deposition, answered countless questions, signed documents. Morris was always present, guiding him through the process with professional patience. Mrs. Clara also gave her testimony, remaining firm and consistent in every detail of her narrative. Veronica hired one of London's most expensive and renowned criminal defense lawyers. As expected, he tried to create alternative narratives, questioned Mrs. Clara's credibility, suggested that the evidence could have been planted. But the quantity and quality of the evidence were simply overwhelming. The greasy gloves, the internet history, the eyewitness testimony, the photos of the cut cables, everything formed an airtight case. In the weeks that followed, Robert discovered more about Veronica's plans through the developments of the investigation. She had discreetly consulted several lawyers about inheritance rights in cases of fatal accidents. She had even surreptitiously increased the value of his life insurance a few months prior, a policy of which she would be the sole beneficiary. Each new revelation was like another stab, confirming how meticulously she had planned everything. The case garnered some media attention, although Maurice worked diligently to keep the most sensitive details out of the tabloids. Still, it was impossible to completely avoid exposure. Robert found himself having to deal with curious glances from acquaintances, veiled questions at social events, the general discomfort of being at the center of a scandal. Julia came to visit him as soon as she learned everything. She was horrified to discover that Veronica, who had always treated her with coolness but never with open hostility, had been capable of something so extreme. Father and daughter spent a lot of time talking, rebuilding bridges that had been damaged by years of distance. Robert realized how much he had lost by not having been more present in her life during all those years. The trial finally took place 6 months after the events. The courtroom was filled with journalists, curious onlookers, and acquaintances of both parties. Robert sat beside Maurice, with Julia on one side and Mrs. Clara on the other. Veronica entered escorted, wearing a discreet suit, and her hair pulled back in a simple bun, very different from the glamorous appearance she usually maintained. The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution meticulously presented all the evidence: the photos, the videos, Mrs. Clara's testimony, expert reports on the severed cables, forensic analysis of the gloves, the complete browsing history from the computer. Every piece of the puzzle was presented clearly and irrefutably. The defense did its best, trying to create reasonable doubt, questioning interpretations and motives, but it was like trying to hold water with your hands. The evidence leaked through every argument, flooding any attempt to build a convincing alternative narrative. Veronica's lawyer was good, but there was no rhetorical magic that could overcome such solid facts. Mrs. Clara took the witness stand and told her story once more. Her sincerity was palpable, every word imbued with evident truth. When the defense lawyer tried to suggest she might have invented everything for some personal reason, she looked at him with dignity and asked what motive she could possibly have to invent something so serious. She had everything to lose and nothing to gain from a lie of that magnitude. Robert also testified, describing his relationship with Veronica, the recent tensions, the conversation they had on the morning of that fateful day. It was painful to relive everything publicly, to expose the intimate details of a failed marriage before a room full of strangers. But he knew it was necessary, that the truth needed to be established completely and unequivocally. Veronica chose not to testify in her own defense, a right her lawyer wisely recommended she exercise. Anything she said on the witness stand could only worsen her situation. She remained seated throughout the trial, with a carefully neutral expression that only occasionally broke when particularly incriminating evidence was presented. The closing arguments were presented. The prosecutor gave an eloquent summary of how the evidence demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that Veronica had premeditated and executed an elaborate plan to severely harm her husband, motivated by greed and resentment. The defense lawyer made a final effort to humanize his client, speaking about emotional difficulties and temporarily impaired judgment, but his words rang hollow against the weight of the evidence. The jury retired to deliberate. Robert, Maurice, Julia, and Mrs. Clara waited in an adjacent room. The hours dragged on, each minute seeming to last an eternity. Robert couldn't stop thinking about how his life had radically changed in just 6 months. Everything he thought he knew about his reality had been turned upside down. Finally, after 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Everyone returned to their seats in the courtroom. The silence was deafening as the jury foreman stood to read the verdict. Guilty. The word echoed through the room like a ringing bell. Veronica closed her eyes, her face paling even further if that were possible. The sentence came 2 weeks later. The judge considered the evident premeditation, the coldness in the execution of the plan, and the seriousness of what could have happened if Mrs. Clara had not intervened. Veronica was sentenced to 16 years of imprisonment. She received the sentence without any visible expression, as if she had emotionally disconnected from the entire situation. Robert watched as she was led away. He felt no satisfaction or joy at the conviction, only a profound sadness and a weariness that seemed to penetrate to his bones. That woman with whom he had shared 10 years of his life, with whom he had made plans and dreams, was now being taken to spend more than a decade behind bars. How was it possible that things had come to this point? In the months that followed the trial, Robert tried to rebuild his life. He sold the mansion, unable to continue living in a place with so many tainted memories. He bought a smaller but comfortable apartment in a quieter neighborhood of London. The sabotage car was taken for inspection and eventually destroyed. He couldn't even look at the vehicle without feeling nauseous. Mrs. Clara used the money Robert had given her to buy a small but cozy house in a working-class neighborhood. It was a place with a yard where she could plant flowers, something she had always dreamed of doing but never had the opportunity. Her grandchildren visited her regularly, and she finally had the security and comfort she deserved after years of hard work. Robert and Julia grew much closer during that period of rebuilding. They dined together regularly, talked about everything and nothing, patiently rebuilding the relationship that had been neglected for so long. Julia helped him choose furniture for the new apartment, gave opinions on decoration, brought life and youth to a space that could have been sad and lonely. One afternoon, about a year after the trial, Robert went to visit Mrs. Clara in her new home. She greeted him with a warm hug and guided him to the kitchen where she had already prepared coffee and homemade cake. They sat at the table, and Robert observed how different she seemed, lighter and more relaxed than he had ever seen her in the 15 years she had worked for him. Mrs. Clara served the coffee, and they chatted about pleasantries for a few minutes. She spoke about her grandchildren, about the garden she was cultivating, about the neighborhood friends she had made. Robert shared about how his businesses were doing, about the plans he was making with Julia to expand one of the companies. It was a peaceful conversation, without the employer-employee dynamic that had previously defined their relationship. Eventually, the conversation naturally drifted to the events that had brought them there. Robert told Mrs. Clara that he often thought about that morning, about what would have happened if she hadn't gone back for her purse, or if she had decided to remain silent out of fear. Mrs. Clara shook her head, saying she wouldn't have been able to live with that weight on her conscience. She explained that she came from a simple but deeply moral family. Her father, who had worked his whole life as a carpenter, had always told her that a person's character was defined by what they did when no one was watching, when there was no reward or recognition at stake. Those values had been her compass throughout her life, and she wasn't going to abandon them precisely when they mattered most. Robert felt his eyes well up. He said that people like her were rare, that they lived in a world where so many chose convenience over courage, silence over truth. Mrs. Clara merely smiled, saying she believed there were more good people in the world than it seemed, only they weren't always the ones who made the most noise or drew the most attention. When Robert finally said goodbye and left her house, driving through the busy streets of London back to his apartment, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, a kind of peace. His life had been turned upside down. He had discovered betrayal of the worst kind imaginable, but he had also witnessed goodness and integrity in its purest form. That night, sitting on his apartment balcony looking at the city lights, Robert reflected on everything he had learned. He learned that money and status did not guarantee character, that sometimes the humblest people possessed the greatest moral wealth. He learned that it was necessary to pay attention to the signs, that ignored problems did not disappear, but fermented and grew into something much worse. More importantly, he learned about gratitude. Not the superficial gratitude we express casually, but the deep and transformative gratitude that comes from recognizing that your life was literally saved by another person's courage. Mrs. Clara didn't have wings. She wasn't a celestial angel from stories, but she had something far more powerful. An honest heart and the courage to do what was right even when it was difficult and frightening. Robert decided that he would dedicate the rest of his life to being worthy of that gift he had received. He would work to be a better father to Julia, a more conscious and ethical businessman, a person who paid attention not only to financial statements, but to human values. He created a foundation to help domestic workers gain access to education and dignified housing, a way to honor what Mrs. Clara represented. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Robert and Mrs. Clara has deeply touched your hearts. This narrative reminds us that true heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear simple uniforms and possess extraordinary hearts. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on the video. Every day we bring unique narratives that celebrate the complexity of the human experience and the values that make us better. Don't miss our upcoming content. We'd love to hear your opinion in the comments. Would you have had Mrs. Clara's courage? What lesson did this story leave for you? We await you there.